Good morning, everybody. During these morning devotionals, we are working our way through the book of Psalms, and today we're going to come to Psalm 16. It has a very different feel to it than many of the laments that we've been looking at. In fact, it reminds me of something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer said. Bonhoeffer, you might remember, was a German theologian, and he ran a seminary during the Nazi regime, an underground seminary, and he did not only the typical lectures, theological lectures that you would expect, but he also had a very rigorous program of trying to shape the devotional lives of his would-be pastors, because he realized they were going to be ministering in a world with a lot of suffering and a lot of trouble. And so he used the Psalms as a kind of a central strategic feature of that. They would read through it every day, many Psalms during the lunch period. And they would do that every day through the month. And so they would go through the entire Psalter every month. So you can imagine these guys are going through the book of Psalms, scores and scores of times. And the reason he did this is because he realized that the book of Psalms covered the range of human feeling and human emotion, of human experience, everything from anxiety and betrayal and suffering to thanksgiving and praise and everything in the middle. And he wanted to prepare these pastors in training to be able to connect with a range of humanity. And his counsel, which I found so helpful, was that when we read the Psalms, we should read them not through a kind of individual lens, but rather through this larger communal lens, realizing that while every psalm might not connect to where we are, it is going to connect to someone in our community. I think that's great wisdom. Now, let's look at some examples of when I say this psalm has a different feel to it. Let me show you what I mean. In verse 3, we read these words, I say of the holy people who are in the land, they are the noble ones, in whom is all my delight. Notice that the holy ones are his delight. You don't hear that much these days. And then notice the contrast in verses 4 and 5. He said, those who run after other gods. In other words, the polytheists of the day, those that were running after false gods, he's saying you're going to run into a dead end. And he says you're going to suffer more and more. And then he shifts and begins to contrast it with his own experience. He says, Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. Notice the word secure and how it contrasts with the suffering of those who pursue other gods. In verse 6, we read, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. Notice pleasant places and delightful inheritance. Probably what he's talking about here are the boundary lines that fell, the parcels of land that fell to the 12 tribes of Israel that were parceled out to them. And so what he's saying in effect is, Lord, you didn't give me, this rocky hillside where I can't plant any crops. You didn't give me a barren desert. You gave me this lush, fertile ground. You've been good to me. I remember the old SNL skit, where the guy speaking, kind of broken English would say, baseball has been very, very good to me. David is saying, Lord, you have been good to me. Look now at verse 9. Therefore my heart is glad, my tongue rejoices, my body also will rest secure. Notice glad, rejoice, secure. And then in verse 11, he sums it up. He said, you will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Joy and eternal pleasures. He's actually anticipating death. He's saying, Lord, I have joy in this lifetime, and I'm going to have even greater joy in the life to come. This psalm has the feel of a personal testimony. Why is David so upbeat? Why is he so positive? It wasn't as if his life was devoid of troubles or tragedy. We know that's not the case. It was rather that his life was full of God. And I want you to remember, I said in a previous devotional that as you go through these psalms, you should constantly be asking yourself the question, what does this teach me about God? And I want to show you just 4 quick things that this psalm brings out about God, which explains the psalmist's experience and why he could speak as he does. He says in verse 1, keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge. So number 1, God was his refuge. He was the one who he ran to in times of trouble. Secondly, in verse 2a, he said, I say to the Lord, Yahweh, you are my Lord, Adonai. Now, whenever you see the word Lord in all caps, it's speaking about the covenant-keeping God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who is Yahweh. And he's saying that Yahweh, you are my Adonai. When you see small case, it's ruler, master, sovereign. So God is not only his refuge, he is his master. And then thirdly, look at the second part of verse 2. He said, apart from you, I have no good thing. He's saying, you're my treasure. Everything that I have good in life comes from your hand. Everything good derives from you. It reminds me of the parable in the New Testament where the parable of the treasure hidden in the field, and the guy goes out and he's digging in a field because they didn't have a treasure that they could put in a bank back then, so they would bury it in the ground. And let's say the guy died, and years later someone comes along and begins to dig and uncovers this treasure. What does he do? His instinct is to go immediately and sell everything that he has because he realizes that this treasure is more than all that he has in life put together. So David is saying, God, you're my treasure. And then finally, notice in verse 7, he said, I will praise the Lord who counsels me. God is his counselor. The joy, the delight, the pleasure that David experienced all goes back to who God is in his life. Now, one final thought, and it's this. God gets bad press. Have you ever noticed? He gets a lot of fake news these days. And where does it come from? The devil literally means slanderer. And from day one, that has been Satan's strategy, a very aggressive campaign to smear and to slander God. The original temptation in the garden was to suggest that God wanted to take all the goodness out of life, that disobeying God would bring true satisfaction. The devil uses that same strategy today, again and again. In fact, in the midst of this pandemic, this global pandemic, it's easy to make life look grim and joyless. Daily we're being inundated with statistics about sickness and disease and death. We're reminded about the skyrocketing unemployment, the crumbling economy. And so you begin to say with the psalmist, wow, this world is just dark, it's gloomy. But in the midst of it all, you see, Psalm 16 is a reminder that those who make God their refuge, their master, their treasure, their counselor, they actually experience Psalm 16.